An elderly couple finds a baby abandoned at their door and decides to raise her. Years later, the girl, Claire, needs emergency surgery. During the examination, the nurse discovers something shocking, leaving the elderly couple horrified. It was a quiet night when Elizabeth and Joseph, an elderly couple, were at home ready for bed. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, startling them both. They looked at each other, confused about why someone would be at the door at that hour. Joseph, with slow steps, went to the door and carefully opened it. There on the ground was a small basket. Inside it, there was a baby wrapped in a soft blanket. The silence of the night was broken by the baby's gentle crying. "Elizabeth, come here," Joseph called, scared. Elizabeth quickly came over and, seeing the baby, covered her mouth with her hand, surprised. "My God, Joseph, who would do this?" she asked, bending down to pick up the baby in her arms. Next to the basket, they found a letter written in a hurry. "I can't take care of her. We know you are good people, Elizabeth and Joseph. Please, take care of Claire as if she were your own. I beg you." They stood there, speechless. Elizabeth, holding the baby, felt her heart tighten. "What are we going to do, Joseph?" He took a deep breath, looking at the baby, who was now calmer. "We can't leave her alone. We'll take care of her, Elizabeth. We don't know who left her here, but this person knew us. We'll give her the love she deserves until we find out who left her here." Elizabeth gently stroked the baby's cheek, moved. "Yes, she will be ours. We'll raise her as if she were our own granddaughter." Time passed and Claire grew up. Since she was little, Elizabeth and Joseph always treated her with great affection, but over the years things began to change. They raised her as if she were a granddaughter, not a daughter, maybe because of their age, maybe out of fear of not knowing how to handle such a young child. Because of this, Claire started to feel this distance, even though she didn't quite understand why. She saw her friends calling their parents Mum and Dad, and always found it strange when her friends asked if Elizabeth and Joseph were Grandma and Grandpa. When she was little, it didn't bother her much, but now, as a teenager, she felt more and more distant from them. "Why do you never treat me like a daughter? Am I just a duty to you?" Claire asked angrily, during one of the more frequent arguments. Elizabeth, with a sad voice, tried to explain. "Claire, we never wanted you to feel like this. We've always loved you." "Love? I'm the only person my age who has to deal with two old people who look more like grandparents than parents," Claire interrupted, not listening to her adoptive mother's words. Joseph stayed silent, not knowing what to say. He knew their love for Claire was real, but he understood that maybe they had made a mistake by not having the courage to take on the role of parents more clearly from the start. Claire distanced herself more every day. She didn't want to talk, didn't care to be around. House responsibilities? She ignored them. If Elizabeth asked for help, she pretended not to hear, or did it reluctantly. "Be careful with what you're doing, Claire. We love you, and all we ask for is a little respect," Elizabeth said, trying to stay calm. But Claire rolled her eyes full of disdain. "Respect? I don't feel like part of this family, and you don't do anything to change that," she replied, leaving them both with heavy Joseph hearts. often tried to calm the situation. "Claire, we just want you to understand that we've always done the best we could," he said with a tired voice. "The best? I'm not your daughter. I never was," Claire shouted, before slamming the door and isolating herself in her room. Elizabeth and Joseph sat in the living room, looking at each other in silence. They knew that raising Claire had been a gift, but now they felt the weight of not having acted differently from the beginning. Claire was rebellious, and that sweet girl they had found at the door seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Each day, the relationship between them became harder. Claire, now almost an adult, no longer respected the house rules. It was as if any request, no matter how small, deeply annoyed her. If Elizabeth asked her to tidy her room, Claire would respond impatiently, "Why me? It's my room. I'll clean it when I want to." Elizabeth, trying to stay calm, explained, "Claire, it's just about keeping things organized. We're not asking much." But Claire would cross her arms and turn away, as if her adoptive mother's words made no sense. "You're not my real parents, so why should I listen to you?" These words always hurt Elizabeth and Joseph, but they knew Claire was going through a difficult phase. Even so, each time she spoke like this, a heavy silence would fall over the house. Elizabeth sighed, tired. and Joseph tried to calm the situation. "Love, we understand you're confused, but this is your home. You have responsibilities like anyone else." Claire shrugged, pacing back and forth, impatient. "Responsibilities? None of this has anything to do with me. You treat me like a child or a stranger, not like a daughter. You never ask me to do anything. Do you think I'm not capable?" The arguments were frequent, mainly because Claire didn't want to do anything around the house. If Elizabeth asked for help with the dishes, she would grumble and often didn't even get up. "I'm not wasting my time washing dishes. That's your job, not mine." Joseph, always trying to avoid things getting worse, insisted, "Claire, it's not about work. We all do our part here. We're just asking you to help out." She huffed out of patience. "If I had real parents, it would be different. You don't get that I'll never feel like your daughter. I'm young, you're old. It's like I'm just a guest here, nothing more." Those words hurt deeply, but Elizabeth and Joseph tried not to show how much it pained them to hear it. They knew deep down that Claire was struggling with something she didn't fully understand, but it was hard to deal with so much rebellion. For her, the age difference between them made her feel like she would never truly be part of the family. As the days went by, the conflicts only grew worse. Claire seemed to be drifting further and further away. Claire was about to turn 18, and to Elizabeth and Joseph it felt like she was pulling away more and more. Around this time, she met Samuel, a boy she started spending a lot of time with. Samuel was different. He had a rebellious attitude, always questioning everything and everyone, and Claire seemed to like that about him. It was as if he understood her in a way her adoptive parents never could. One day, Claire came home later than usual. Elizabeth, worried, was waiting in the living room. "Claire, why are you so late? You should have been home by now," she asked, her voice firm but full of concern. Claire, rolling her eyes, replied, "I was with Samuel. He's my boyfriend now and I don't need permission to be with him." Elizabeth was surprised. "Boyfriend? Claire, you didn't even tell us about him. Who is this Samuel?" "He's someone who understands me, unlike you," Claire said with attitude. "You never ask me anything. Samuel makes me feel alive, makes me feel normal." Joseph walked into the room at that moment, trying to keep calm. "Love, we're just worried about you. We want to know who this boy is, who you're spending time with." Claire crossed her arms, irritated. "You'll never understand. Samuel's not like you. He's free, not stuck to these silly rules. He lets me be who I am." Elizabeth tried again, her voice soft. "We just want what's best for you, Claire. We're not trying to control you, we just want to make sure you're safe." "Safe? Do you think he's dangerous or something?" Claire asked sarcastically. "Samuel's amazing. You two are the ones living in this small world. I'm turning 18, I'm not a child anymore." The atmosphere in the house was becoming more and more tense. Samuel, with his rebellious ways, seemed to have a big influence over Claire. She felt stronger around him, more independent, but it only widened the gap between her and her adoptive parents. Joseph sighed, tired but still worried. "Claire, we only want the best for you. No matter your age, we're still responsible for you." Claire looked at him with disdain in her eyes. "Responsible? You can barely be my grandparents, let alone be responsible." With that, she went up to her room, leaving Elizabeth and Joseph alone in the living room, unsure of what else they could do. Their love for Claire had never been in doubt, but she was being drawn in by Samuel, a boy who seemed to bring more challenges than any of them were ready to face. As days passed, Samuel's presence in Claire's life grew stronger, and this only increased the conflicts at home. Samuel had a way of making Claire believe she didn't need to follow the rules, that her adoptive parents' ways were outdated, and that she should be free to do whatever she wanted. Claire, already confused and full of conflicting emotions, started drifting even further away from Elizabeth and Joseph. One afternoon, Claire came home with a frown, threw her backpack on the sofa, and went straight to the kitchen to get something to eat. Elizabeth, who was setting the table, noticed her mood and tried to talk. "Claire, what's going on? You barely talk to us anymore," Elizabeth asked, with a tone of concern. Claire opened the fridge roughly and replied without looking at her adoptive mother, "Nothing's going on. I just don't want to stay here listening to the same things over and over." Elizabeth sighed, trying to stay patient. "We just want to understand what's happening with you. Since you started seeing Samuel, you've changed so much. Claire turned around angrily, her voice louder. "I've changed because you treat me like a child. I'm turning 18, and Samuel is helping me see life as it really is." At that moment, Joseph entered the kitchen, hearing the argument. "Love, no one is trying to control you. We just want you to think about what's best for you. We don't like the way Samuel has been influencing you." "Influencing?" Claire repeated mockingly. "You don't even know him. Samuel makes me realize I don't need to follow your ridiculous rules. He really supports me." Joseph crossed his arms, trying to stay calm. "That's not true, Claire. He's pulling you away from us. You're becoming more aggressive, disrespectful. We're not your enemies." "I'm aggressive because you don't understand me. Samuel tells me I should live my life and not be stuck with your expectations," Claire argued, full of conviction. Elizabeth tried to intervene, her voice calm but firm. "We just want you to be happy, Claire. But what we're seeing now is that you're becoming someone who doesn't seem like our daughter anymore. This isn't how you'll find happiness." Claire laughed bitterly. "Your daughter? You're not even my real parents. That's why I'll never feel like I belong in this family. You just want me to be who you want, not who I am." Those words hurt deeply. Elizabeth couldn't take it anymore. She watched her relationship with Claire fall apart before her eyes, and Samuel, with all his influence, only seemed to make things worse. One night, after another intense argument between Claire and Joseph, Elizabeth sat in silence, thinking about what she could do. She knew that Claire didn't feel like part of the family, and that the age gap between them created an invisible but very real barrier. While everyone was in their rooms, she went to Claire's. The girl was lying on her bed, looking at her phone, not seeming interested in talking. Elizabeth took a deep breath and entered the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Claire, I need to talk to you," she said softly, trying not to sound too worried. Claire didn't take her eyes off the phone. "What now, another lecture about Samuel?" she asked, sounding tired. Elizabeth stayed quiet for a moment, unsure how to start. "No, it's not about Samuel. It's about us." That made Claire lower her phone and look at Elizabeth, curious but still with a face full of distrust. "What do you mean by us? I know you don't feel like you belong here, and I know a lot of that is our fault, mine and Joseph's. We never treated you like a real daughter. We always acted like you were a granddaughter, so we didn't demand much from you, and that must have made you feel alone, even here with us," Elizabeth said, trying not to cry. For the first time, Claire stayed quiet, not arguing back. "I've been thinking, maybe it's better if we leave here, just the two of us," Elizabeth suggested, hesitating. "Get you away from this environment that's suffocating you. Maybe, away from all of this, you can find yourself. And we can too." Claire looked at her, confused. "Leave here? Run away? Sometime, somewhere? And what about Dad? You want to leave him? He knows our relationship is difficult, that you need space. And I'm willing to do anything to save what we have. I don't want to lose you, Claire." Claire stayed silent for a while, thinking about her adoptive mother's offer. It wasn't what she expected to hear. Part of her was tempted by the idea, running away, starting fresh with no pressure. On the other hand, it seemed so drastic, so sudden. "I don't know. Would you really leave everything behind for me?" Claire asked. Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, held Claire's hand. "I'd do anything for you, my daughter. Anything. I just want you to have a chance to be happy, without all this weight." The room stayed silent for a moment. Claire looked at her adoptive mother, feeling a lump in her throat for the first time. She didn't know what to say, but for the first time in a long time, she felt that Elizabeth was willing to make a real sacrifice for her. "I'll think about it, okay?" Claire said, a little softer, without the usual rebellion. Elizabeth gently stroked Claire's hair, got up, and left the room. That night, both of them went to bed with different thoughts, but the same feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could change if they took that step together. A few weeks passed since Elizabeth had suggested spending time away with Claire. Things hadn't improved much. Claire was still distant, but something seemed different. She was quieter than usual, more withdrawn. Elizabeth and Joseph noticed, but they didn't know what was going on. One night during dinner, the silence at the table was almost unbearable. Elizabeth looked at Claire, who was barely touching her food, and decided to ask. "Claire, are you all right? "You've been so quiet lately. Did something happen?" Claire stopped, stirring her food with her fork without looking at her parents. She stayed silent for a while, as if deciding whether to speak or not. Finally, she took a deep breath and said bluntly, "I'm pregnant." The impact was immediate. Elizabeth dropped her fork onto her plate, eyes wide, not knowing what to say. Joseph, who had been quiet, froze, as if he'd been shocked. The silence that followed was heavy. "Pregnant?" Elizabeth managed to say, her voice shaky. How can you be pregnant? Are you sure?" Claire, still not looking at either of them, still in shock, answered directly, "But what about Samuel? I'm sure. Does he know? I took a test." Claire finally looked up, nervous, but with the same defiant tone. "Yes, he knows, but that doesn't change anything. The point is, I'm going to have this baby." Elizabeth stayed silent, trying to process everything. Her heart was racing. The daughter she and Joseph had raised, who still seemed so young and full of uncertainty, was now about to become a mother. "Are you ready for this?" Elizabeth asked, Claire, her eyes full of concern. "This is serious," Claire scoffed, as if tired of being treated like a child. "I know it's serious, but I'm going to handle it. It's my life, my baby." Joseph, who had stayed quiet, spoke more calmly now, but with a face full of worry. "Claire, we're here to help you, but you need to understand that raising a child isn't easy. We're old now. We can't be responsible for all of this." Claire looked at both of them, feeling a knot in her stomach. She knew she was asking for a lot. She knew her adoptive parents, already elderly, couldn't take on this new burden. But at the same time, she felt like she had no choice. The baby was on the way, and nothing would change that. Elizabeth took a deep breath and held Joseph's hand, trying to find strength. "Claire, we'll always be by your side, but you need to think about what's coming. We can't do this for you. Not this time." Claire, no matter how hard she tried to stay firm, felt a tear escape. She knew she was lost, that the life she knew was about to change forever, and despite all her rebellion, deep down, she just wanted to know she wouldn't be alone. Elizabeth stood up and, with all the tenderness of a mother, hugged Claire. "We'll get through this together, love. It won't be easy, but we'll find a way. We always have." For the first time in a long time, Claire allowed herself to be hugged. And in that moment, even with all the confusion in her mind, she felt that she still had a safe place to land. Even though everything was changing, Elizabeth and Joseph were still there, ready to face whatever came next. With the pregnancy still early but progressing, Claire and Samuel decided they needed a place of their own. It wasn't possible to keep living at Elizabeth and Joseph's house anymore. The arguments, the weight of responsibility, everything seemed harder to handle. So Claire suggested to Samuel that they rent a house. He said it was their chance to start fresh, to build a life for the baby, away from the worried looks of Claire's adoptive parents. After searching for a while, they found a small house in a simple neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it had the basics. 2 bedrooms, a cramped living room, and a tiny kitchen. It was what they could afford, and for Claire the important thing was having a place where they could be a family, as Samuel always said. On moving day, Elizabeth and Joseph came to help, even though it broke their hearts. Elizabeth folded some baby clothes and placed them in boxes, while Claire looked around, nervous. "Are you all right, love?" Elizabeth asked, noticing the uneasiness in Claire's eyes. Claire shrugged, trying to seem more confident than she really was. "I'm fine. It's just strange, you know? Everything's changing so fast." Elizabeth smiled, a sad smile. "I know, but you don't have to face it alone. If you need anything, we'll be here, in a flash to help you." Claire sighed. She knew her adoptive parents were worried, but she felt like she had to go down this path with Samuel, no matter how uncertain it seemed. "Thanks, Mum. I know you both just want to help, but now I have to do things my way." Later at the new house, Samuel arrived with some grocery bags. He seemed excited, as if this move was an adventure. "Here we are, love, our new home," he said, dropping the bags on the small kitchen table. Claire looked at him and tried to smile. "I hope we can handle this." "Of course we can," Samuel replied confidently. "We're ready for this. Now we just wait for the baby, and everything will fall into place." But deep down, Claire had her doubts. The house was simple, almost empty, and the reality of raising a baby seemed far scarier than Samuel let on. They didn't even have a crib yet, and their savings were running out. Samuel kept saying he'd find a better job, but so far, his promises hadn't turned into reality. In the days that followed, Claire kept busy preparing for the baby. She arranged the little they had, folded the clothes Elizabeth had given her, and tried to get ready for what was coming. But the truth was, she felt alone even with Samuel by her side. They argued often, mostly about money and the future. "I'm doing the best I can, Claire. It's not easy finding work in this town," Samuel yelled, frustrated when the fights got heated. "I know, but we've got a baby on the way, Samuel. We can't keep living like this forever," Claire responded, exhausted. The house, which once seemed like a new hope, was now filling with tension and worry. Claire looked down at her growing belly and wondered if they were ready for everything that was coming. She wanted to believe they were, but the doubts only grew with each passing day. One day, everything seemed normal. Claire woke up early as usual, expecting to find Samuel in the kitchen, maybe making coffee or looking at his phone, as he often did. But the kitchen was empty. At first, she didn't find it strange. Maybe he'd gone out to take care of something, go for a walk, or even look for a job like he had promised many times. But as the hours passed and Samuel didn't come back, anxiety began to grow inside her. Claire sent several messages, but none of them were answered. She called a few times and his phone went straight to voicemail. The silence from the phone made Claire's heart race, and a strange fear started forming in her chest. By the end of the afternoon, the reality became clearer. Samuel had disappeared. He left without saying anything, without leaving a note, without even looking back. Claire felt the tears start to well up, but at the same time, a huge anger rose with the despair. How could he do this to her, to the baby? She sat on the sofa, her hands trembling, and tried to think of some explanation. Maybe he needed some time. Maybe he was scared. But deep down, he had run away, taking half of his clothes with Samuel wasn't coming back. He ran to escape all the responsibility that was about to fall on them. Later that night, Claire called Elizabeth, barely able to speak. "Mum, he's gone. Samuel left me. I'm all alone." Elizabeth, on the other end of the line, was silent for a moment, trying to take in what Claire had just said. "Oh, my love. I knew he was under pressure. Didn't seem trustworthy. Do you want me to come over? I never thought he'd do this." Claire tried to hold back the tears, but they streamed down her face. "I don't know what to do. I can't do this alone. The baby. How am I going to raise a child by myself?" "You're not alone, Claire," Elizabeth replied, her voice gently firm. "Your father and I are here. We'll help you with the baby. Samuel may have run away, but we would never do that to you." Claire knew she could count on them, but the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. She looked around the almost empty house at the half-filled shopping bags, and the silence around her only made everything scarier. "I'm coming home. Back to your house." "I can't stay here," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Come, love. We'll be waiting for you," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. Claire returned to her adoptive parents' house without looking back. Her heart was heavy, her mind confused, and the pain of Samuel's departure still weighed on her shoulders. She couldn't understand how he could just leave, abandon her and the baby on the way. The house they had rented, which seemed like the start of a new life, was now empty and lifeless. When she arrived at Elizabeth and Joseph's house, the door was already open, as if they had been waiting for her the whole time. Elizabeth rushed to hug Claire the moment she saw her at the door. The hug was tight, full of emotion. Claire, who had tried to hold back her tears, broke down in her adoptive mother's arms. "I couldn't keep him, Mum, he's gone," she said, sobbing. Elizabeth stroked Claire's hair, not letting go, with the calm only a mother can have in a moment like this. "He didn't deserve you, Claire. He didn't have the courage to face life by your side. But we are here, we always have been. We'll get through this together." Joseph, who was standing in the living room, watching with a heavy heart, slowly approached and placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. "You'll always have a home here, love, no matter what happens." Still crying, Claire looked at Joseph and tried to smile, but the emotional exhaustion was too much. "I just wanted things to be different. I wanted him to stay. I thought we could be a family." Elizabeth gently guided her inside, leading her to the sofa. "We always have been. No matter what Samuel did or didn't do, you and your baby will have our love, our support. You don't have to face this alone." Claire sat on the sofa, hugging a cushion, still trying to process everything. I feel so lost. How am I going to raise a baby now? Everything feels so hard, so impossible." Joseph sat beside her and spoke with his calm, steady voice. "One day at a time, love. You have a strength you might not even realize. And remember, you'll never be alone. We're here to help you. Elizabeth looked at Claire with tenderness and added, "I can take care of another baby. We'll face this together." Elizabeth's words were like a relief to Claire, who for the first time in days felt a small bit of hope in her heart. She knew the journey would be hard, that raising a child wouldn't be easy. But there, in her parents' house, surrounded by love, she realized that maybe she had a chance to start again. As the days passed, Claire tried to adjust to her new reality. She was still hurt by Samuel's departure, but now, back at her adoptive parents' house, she felt a little stronger. Her belly was growing, and with it, the fear and anxiety of becoming a mother so young. Even so, Elizabeth and Joseph were by her side, doing everything they could to help. One quiet afternoon, Claire was sitting on the sofa, distractedly folding some baby clothes that Elizabeth had saved. Elizabeth came into the room and sat next to her, watching as Claire carefully folded the tiny clothes. "Did you know these were your first clothes?" Elizabeth said with a soft smile. Claire looked at her adoptive mother and smiled a little sadly. "It's strange to think you've been through this before. I feel so lost. How am I going to take care of a baby?" Elizabeth gently held Claire's hand. "I felt the same way when you showed up at our door." "But you know something, Claire. I've taken care of 2 babies in my life. One of them was you, that beautiful baby left on our doorstep." Claire stayed silent for a moment, taking in those words. "2 babies?" She looked at Elizabeth, confused. "I thought it was just me." Elizabeth took a deep breath, her eyes full of tenderness. "It's a long, sad story, but now it's you and your baby. I took care of you with all the love in the world, and now I'll take care of this new baby too. I've done it before and I'll do it again." Still surprised, Claire looked down at her belly, then back at Elizabeth. "But I'm different. I was just a baby you found. How can you care for another one like this, knowing it's mine?" Elizabeth smiled, her eyes shining. "Because, love, there's no limit to love. When we found you, we didn't know where you came from, but the love we felt was instant. And now, with this baby coming, it doesn't matter how the story started. What matters is that they'll have love. The same love we gave you, we'll give to them." Claire felt her heart tighten, but this time it wasn't from sadness, it was from relief. She leaned in to hug Elizabeth, and for the first time in a long while, she let the tears fall, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Mum. I don't know what I'd do without you and Dad," Claire said, her voice shaky but full of emotion. Elizabeth gently stroked Claire's hair, with the same tenderness she'd had when Claire was a baby. "We'll always be here for you, love. Always. And together, we'll take care of this baby with all the love we have." After that conversation with Elizabeth, something began to bother Claire. The idea that Elizabeth had taken care of 2 babies stayed in her mind, and the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. She couldn't understand how she had never known about another baby besides herself. Elizabeth had always been very open about Claire's adoption, but she had never mentioned another child. One night, sitting at the dinner table with Elizabeth and Joseph, Claire couldn't hold back her doubt any longer. She pushed her food around her plate, barely eating, until she finally decided to speak. "Mum, I need to ask you something," she began, her voice a little hesitant. Elizabeth and Joseph exchanged glances, noticing the seriousness in Claire's tone. "Of course, love. What is it?" Elizabeth replied, looking concerned. "That afternoon, you said you'd taken care of 2 babies. Who was the other baby?" "Because as far as I know, it's always just been me," Claire asked, looking directly at Elizabeth. Elizabeth was silent for a moment, seeming surprised by the question. She took a deep breath, as if trying to organize her thoughts. Joseph, sitting beside her, also looked tense, as if he had been expecting this conversation for a long time. "Claire, When I said I'd taken care of 2 babies, I was talking about you and the baby that's about to be born, Elizabeth explained calmly, trying to ease Claire's confusion. Claire frowned, still clearly confused. But why did you say it like you had taken care of someone else besides me, like there was another child? Joseph, who had been quiet up until then, maybe it was just the way things were said. But no, there wasn't another baby, just you and now your baby who's on the way. Claire sat in silence for a while, processing their words. Something still didn't quite fit. She had always known that she had been left on Elizabeth and Joseph's doorstep, but this new information raised more questions. And you never thought about having another child? After me? Elizabeth quickly glanced at Joseph as if they were discussing something silently. No, Claire. After you came into our lives, you were everything to us. We never thought about another child. You filled our home, our hearts, Elizabeth said with sincerity. Claire looked at them both, still a little suspicious, but the answer seemed genuine. Even so, there was something in the way Elizabeth had said it, something that left Claire with the feeling that a part of the story was still missing. The atmosphere at home was tense after the last conversation, and Claire couldn't stop thinking about the answers that didn't seem to make sense. She knew that Elizabeth and Joseph were hiding something. There was a mystery, something they had never told her, and Claire was determined to find out what it was. One afternoon, while Joseph was sitting on the porch, reading an old newspaper as he often did, Claire decided she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong any longer. She sat next to him, took a deep breath, and spoke directly. Dad, I need you to be honest with me. You're hiding something from me, aren't you? Joseph slowly lowered the newspaper, looking at Claire. He stayed silent for a few seconds, as if trying to find the right words. What do you mean by that, Claire? I asked about what Mum said about 2 babies, and you always avoid it like you're afraid to talk about it. I feel like there's more to this story. Have you told me everything? Claire asked, her eyes fixed on her father, waiting for a straight answer. Joseph let out a long sigh, and for the first time, Claire saw something in his face that seemed like more than just tiredness. It looked like pain. He stared at the ground for a moment, as if reliving something he had buried a long time ago. Claire, there's something we never told you, because it was too hard for us, he began, his voice heavy. We had a child many years ago, a son we loved very much. Claire sat in silence, shocked by the revelation. A son, she repeated, not believing it. I never knew. When he was young, he became rebellious like you did at times. Joseph took a deep breath. He wouldn't accept our rules, didn't want to live the way we did. Our son, when he turned 18, he decided to distanced himself from us. He said he couldn't stand living with us anymore, insulted us, and left. I think he went to another country. He never contacted us again. The first few years were very hard. Claire stared at her father, unsure of what to say. The idea that Elizabeth and Joseph had a son who had simply abandoned them was something she never could have imagined. And he never came back, she asked, her voice quiet. Joseph shook his head slowly. No, he left, and we never heard from him again. We tried, Claire, we called, we did everything we could, but he made his choice. He left us and went on with his life far away, as if we'd never existed. Claire felt a lump forming in her throat. All these years, she thought she knew everything about her adoptive family, and now she was discovering a part of the story that had been kept quiet. Why did you never tell me? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Joseph looked at Claire with sad but honest eyes. Because it was too painful, love. We lost our son. When we found you, it was like we had a new chance to have a family. You filled the emptiness he left, and we loved you as if you'd been ours from the beginning. Claire sat in silence, absorbing the story. The revelation weighed on her, but at the same time it made sense. She finally understood why Elizabeth and Joseph were so afraid of losing her, why they were so protective, and why there was always a shadow of sadness in their eyes. I'll never leave you, Claire said firmly, holding Joseph's hand. I'm part of this family, no matter what. Joseph smiled, a sad but relieved smile. You'll always be ours, Claire. Always. And in that moment, even with the new truths, Claire felt that her bond with Elizabeth and Joseph was stronger than ever. After hearing the story about the son Joseph and Elizabeth had lost, Claire was left with more questions in her mind. If they had gone through something so painful, why did they choose to take care of her? What exactly had happened on the day she was left at their door? It felt like she was finally starting to piece together a puzzle that had always been incomplete. One night after dinner, while they were sitting in the living room, Claire decided to ask. Elizabeth was knitting on the sofa, and Joseph was reading his newspaper as usual. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the need to finally understand everything. "Mum, Dad, I want to know more about the day you found me," she began, hesitant but determined. "What do you remember about that night? How was it when you found me at the door?" Elizabeth stopped knitting, her eyes slowly lifting to meet Claire's. Joseph folded his newspaper and placed it on his lap, knowing this was a difficult but necessary topic. Elizabeth began, her voice soft and a little shaky. "I remember it like it was yesterday, Claire. It was a cold night, much colder than usual. Your father and I were getting ready for bed when we heard the doorbell ring. We thought it was strange because it was late and no one came to our house at that time." Joseph continued, his voice firm but filled with memory. "I went to the door thinking maybe it was a neighbor needing help, but when I opened it, there you were, so small, wrapped in a blanket. You were crying softly like you knew you were in a strange place. Next to your little basket, there was a letter." Claire listened carefully, her hands clenched in her lap. "What did the letter say?" Elizabeth looked at Joseph and then spoke, her voice heavy with emotion. "The letter said that your parents couldn't take care of you. They didn't explain why. They just asked us to take care of you because they knew we were good people. It was like they left you here because they believed this was the best place for you." Claire felt her heart tighten. "And you? You didn't hesitate to take me in?" Joseph shook his head. "Not for a second. When I looked at you so helpless, something in my heart told me that we needed you as much as you needed us. We had already lost our son, and taking care of you, it was like a new beginning. We knew we couldn't have another chance with our son, but we could give you a better life." Claire lowered her head, tears starting to well up in her eyes. "I always wondered why you took me in, even with the pain of losing a child." Elizabeth leaned forward, gently taking Claire's hands. "Because that's what love does, my dear. It grows in the most unexpected places. When we found you that night, you brought back a part of what we had lost. And no matter where you came from, you became our daughter that night." Claire wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to hold back her emotions. "I never knew you went through all of that. And still, you gave me everything." Joseph smiled, a smile full of tenderness. "We received more than we gave, Claire. You gave us a reason to keep going. And now with the baby growing in your belly, this story will continue. We'll take care of both of you, just like we always have." Claire, feeling a mix of gratitude and sadness, hugged them both. As mysterious as her origins might be, she knew in that moment that what truly mattered was the love Elizabeth and Joseph had always given her, without asking for anything in return. One day, Claire was in the kitchen with Elizabeth, helping to prepare breakfast, when she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her back. The pain was so intense that she dropped the cup she was holding, shattering it on the floor. Elizabeth, worried, rushed over to her. "Claire, what is it? Are you okay?" Elizabeth asked, panicking as she helped Claire sit down. Claire placed a hand on her back, trying to hold back a groan of pain. "I don't know, Mum. It hurt a lot, all of a sudden. I think it might just be exhaustion." But the pain didn't go away, and it worsened with each minute. Joseph, realizing the situation was serious, came into the room and quickly suggested they take her to the hospital. At the hospital, after a few tests, the doctors discovered that Claire was having a kidney crisis. The intense pain was caused by a serious complication, and she would need to stay in the hospital for further tests and treatment. The news was a shock to everyone, as it came on so suddenly. Later, the doctor came into the room where Claire was lying, with Elizabeth and Joseph by her side. The doctor looked concerned, but also calm, as if he was trying to prepare them for something important. "Claire, we found something in the tests," he began, looking at her and then at her parents. "You have a hereditary kidney condition. It was probably passed down from your biological mother." Claire looked at the doctor, confused. "A hereditary condition? But what does that mean?" he explained carefully. "It's a genetic disease that affects the kidneys. From what we've seen, this condition was passed to you by your biological mother. You'll need a kidney transplant, but the first thing is to find a compatible donor." Elizabeth, standing next to Claire, squeezed her hand, trying to be strong, but the fear was clear on her face. "And how do we find a donor? Can I donate for her?" The doctor shook his head gently. "We'll test you and everyone close to her, but the most important thing would be to find someone from Claire's biological family. Since it's a hereditary condition, a biological relative is more likely to be a match." Claire, who had been trying to process the information, felt her chest tighten. "My biological mother, I don't even know who she is. How are we going to find a donor like that?" Elizabeth, always trying to be Claire's rock, looked at her lovingly. "We'll find a solution, love. One way or another, we'll make it happen." Joseph also stepped closer, his face serious. "We'll do the tests, and if we have to, we'll search the ends of the earth for your biological family. But you're not going to face this alone." The fear of the illness and the idea of needing a kidney transplant were terrifying, but at that moment, Claire knew she had the unconditional support of Elizabeth and Joseph. Even though her biological origins were still a mystery, the love her adoptive parents gave her was the strength she needed to face this new battle. They knew that every day was important. The next day, both went to the hospital to get tested, and soon the news spread among friends and those close to them. Everyone who knew Claire wanted to help in some way. Even though they weren't biological relatives, many insisted on going to the hospital to see if they could be compatible donors. The support was huge, but the worry grew as well. The chances of finding a match outside of her biological family were small. At the hospital, while waiting for the results, Elizabeth sat beside Claire, who was lying in bed, her mind full of thoughts. "I didn't know so many people cared about me," Claire said quietly. Elizabeth held her hand gently. "Of course they care, love. You're very special. Everyone who knows you wants to see you well." Claire sighed, staring at the ceiling. "But what if no one's a match, Mum? I don't even know where to start looking for my biological family." Joseph, who was standing by the bed, stepped in. "If no one here is a match, we'll keep searching, Claire. We won't give up until we find someone." Time seemed to pass slowly as they waited for the test results. Elizabeth and Joseph had been tested, as had some family friends. Each of them hoped to be the solution to save Claire, but the doctors made it clear that the best chances were with biological relatives, due to the hereditary nature of the condition. Days later, the doctor returned to Claire's room with the initial results. "Unfortunately, none of the tests so far have shown a full match," he said, his expression serious but trying to be as understanding as possible. "We still have more people to test, but we need to start thinking about alternatives. Perhaps trying to locate your biological relatives should be the next step." Claire, her face pale, nodded slowly, trying to take in the news. "So, everything depends on a family I don't even know?" Elizabeth, with a soft but firm voice, responded immediately. "No matter how hard it gets, we'll find a solution. We won't let you go through this alone." The hospital was busy, doctors and nurses moving around, but inside that room, the worry was tangible. The coming weeks would be crucial, and though the support was immense, the weight of finding a compatible donor for Claire kept growing. Claire knew she wasn't alone, but the uncertainty of relying on a family she had never known made the fear inside her grow. What she didn't know at that moment was that the truth about her biological family was about to change everything. Days later, at the hospital, as Elizabeth and Joseph waited with Claire for more test results, a nurse entered the room holding a clipboard. It seemed like a normal day of medical routine until something unexpected happened. The nurse began speaking casually, not realizing the importance of what she was about to say. "Well, Claire, we've finally found a compatible donor for your kidney transplant, and the good news is, it's a close relative, your biological father." Suddenly, the room went completely silent. Elizabeth and Joseph exchanged confused looks, not understanding what the nurse had just said. Claire, for a second, thought she had misheard. "Biological father?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" The nurse, realizing her mistake, widened her eyes and became visibly flustered. "Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it that way. I just thought, well, the tests show that Joseph is most likely to be the compatible donor, and I assumed you all knew. Joseph went pale, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at Claire. Biological father. But that means I'm her adoptive father. Who is the biological father? The nurse, sensing the confusion, tried to correct the situation. Yes, sir. According to the tests, you are compatible with Claire, and that usually happens when there's a very close biological connection. The tests indicate that you're her grandfather, and given your age, the best option would be for your son to donate. Claire was in shock. Dad, how is this possible? Am I your granddaughter? Joseph looked at Elizabeth, who was just as stunned. He shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. But we found you on our doorstep. How could you be my granddaughter if I didn't know I had one? The nurse, realizing that the situation was far more complicated than she had thought, apologized again and left the room, leaving the three of them alone with this new revelation. Claire, still in disbelief, turned to her parents, her mind racing with questions. Does this mean my biological father is the son you lost? He's my father, Claire asked, her voice trembling. Joseph put his hands to his face, trying to process the discovery. I don't know. It's been so many years since he left. We never imagined he could have had a daughter, and now this. Claire, this changes everything. Elizabeth, trying to stay calm, moved closer to Claire and held her hands. We'll figure out the truth step by step, but one thing is certain. The love we feel for you will never change, no matter what. Claire, still shocked, felt a whirlwind of emotions. The revelation that she was biologically connected to Joseph and Elizabeth didn't change the love they had for her, but it brought up so many questions about her past, the identity of her biological father, the reason she was left on Elizabeth and Joseph's doorstep. Everything was now up in the air, waiting to be uncovered. She looked at Joseph, who still seemed lost in thought. Dad, Granddad, what happened to my father? Why did he leave me with you without ever saying anything? Joseph sighed, knowing that the story of his son's past was about to be unearthed, a story he never thought he would have to tell. The mood at home was tense after the revelation at the hospital. Everyone was trying to understand what it all meant. Claire couldn't stop thinking about what the nurse had said. How could she be Joseph and Elizabeth's granddaughter when she had been left at their door as an abandoned baby? That night, after much confusion, Claire sat down with Joseph and Elizabeth in the living room. The silence was heavy, but Claire knew she needed to hear the truth. Dad, can you explain to me? How is it possible that I'm your biological granddaughter? What really happened to your son? Claire asked, her voice hesitant but determined. Joseph sighed deeply, clearly troubled by having to relive those memories. He looked at Elizabeth, who simply nodded as if to say that it was time to tell everything. Claire, he began, his voice tired, the son your mother and I had, your father, left home many years ago. He was rebellious, stubborn, always wanting to do things his own way. When he turned 18, he decided to leave the country. He wanted to run away from everything, responsibilities, family. We told him we would always be here, but he chose to leave, and we never heard from him again. Claire listened to every word, her heart racing. This was the first time she had heard the full story. Your mother and I were devastated. We lost contact with him, had no idea where he was. Years passed without any news. And then one night the doorbell rang, and there you were, a baby on the doorstep. With a letter, Joseph continued, the pain in his voice clear. I remember the letter, Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. It said they couldn't take care of me. Joseph nodded. Yes, the letter said your biological parents couldn't take care of you, but now, with everything we know, it makes sense. Claire, the truth is, your father was our son. He left you with us. He thought he couldn't raise you. Elizabeth wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek, her voice faltering as she tried to speak. When we found you, we didn't know you were our granddaughter. The letter didn't say anything about that. It only said you needed us, and we took you in with all the love we had. Claire felt a knot in her stomach. So, my father left me here with you. Joseph lowered his head, trying to hold back his tears. "It seems he didn't have the strength to care for you. When he left the country, we thought he had forgotten us, but now we realize he knew exactly where to bring you. He knew that with us, you would have a better life." Claire sat in silence for a while, trying to process everything. "Did he ever try to come back?" she asked, her voice low, almost afraid of the answer. Elizabeth, her eyes full of tears, shook her head. "No, love, never. Until now we didn't know he had left, and we never heard from him again. We only knew that you were our miracle that night." The weight of the truth fell on Claire. She was the daughter of a man who had run away, who hadn't had the strength to stay and take responsibility, but at the same time, she was the granddaughter of a couple who had loved her unconditionally from the moment they found her. Claire looked at Joseph and Elizabeth, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. "So even though you didn't know I was your granddaughter, you raised me as your daughter." Joseph smiled despite the tears in his eyes. "You were always our daughter, Claire. From the moment we held you in our arms, you became part of our family. Whether by blood or not, that never mattered," Elizabeth added, her voice soft but full of love. "What matters is the love we've always had for you, love. And now, more than ever, we know that this bond is even stronger." Claire felt tears rolling down her face, but this time they were tears of relief. The truth was painful, but at last she knew where she came from. She knew who her parents were, and most importantly, she knew that despite everything, she had never been alone. Hugging Joseph and Elizabeth, she whispered, "Thank you for never giving up on me. I wouldn't be anything without you." And in that tight embrace, Claire felt that despite all the challenges, she was finally at peace with her past and with the family that had always loved her. The news about the surgery came quickly, and Claire didn't have much time to process everything that was happening. Her kidney problem was getting worse, and the doctors said the transplant couldn't wait. They had already found the necessary donation. Amidst all the pressure and fear, she was still carrying the baby inside her. At just 3.5 months pregnant, the pregnancy was one of the few certainties Claire had, even though the whole situation was terrifying. In the hospital, before the surgery, Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Elizabeth and Joseph stood by her side, holding her hands. The atmosphere was tense and everyone's worry was clear. "Everything will be okay, love," Elizabeth said, trying to stay calm. "The doctors are good, and we're here with you." Claire gave a weak smile, but inside she was scared. The thought of facing surgery and the risk it posed to the baby made her anxious. She loved the life growing inside her, but the fear of not being able to care for the baby, mixed with the pain of everything she had gone through with Samuel, weighed on her heart. Minutes before being taken into surgery, Claire looked at her mum and whispered, "What if something happens to the baby, Mum? What will I do?" Elizabeth gently squeezed her hand, her eyes full of love and understanding. "Claire, no matter what happens, you'll have the strength to get through it. Everything happens in its own time, and you have us. We're in this together." With a nod, the doctors took Claire into surgery. The procedure lasted hours, and the tension in the hospital Elizabeth and Joseph waited in the waiting room, praying that everything would go well. Later, the doctor came into the room with a serious but calm expression. "The surgery was successful. Claire is doing well, but there were complications. Unfortunately, she lost the baby during the procedure." Elizabeth and Joseph looked at each other, speechless. The weight of that news was overwhelming, and when Claire woke up, they were by her side, ready to tell her what had happened. Claire slowly opened her eyes, feeling weak but relieved to be alive. She looked at her parents, and before they could say anything, she asked, "The baby? Is the baby okay?" Elizabeth, her eyes filled with tears, held Claire's hand and gently replied, "No, love. The baby didn't make it." A deep silence filled the room. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, expecting to feel the weight of the grief, but surprisingly, something different emerged inside her. Claire felt a sense of relief. She knew she wasn't ready to be a mother. She was still lost, still healing her wounds, and maybe, in some way, losing the baby was a new beginning for her. She looked at Elizabeth and, to everyone's surprise, said something no one expected. "It's okay, Mum. I think this was for the best. I'm not sure I was ready to be a mother now." Elizabeth, still surprised, gently held
We know this
Claire's
was hard,
face.
but everything will be all right.
"Love, you'll have your
You're
time,
so
your
strong.
life, and when you're ready, things will happen in the right way." Claire, still feeling the exhaustion from the surgery, smiled softly. "I just feel like now I can focus on myself, on healing, on understanding who I am before bringing a new life into the world. Maybe it wasn't the right time, and everything happened as it should." Joseph, emotional, came closer to the bed and kissed Claire's forehead. "You're so brave, my love. We're here as always, and we'll face whatever comes together." And in that moment, despite the loss, Claire felt a peace she hadn't expected. She knew the pain was still there, but now there was also a sense that even in the most difficult circumstances, things happened for a reason. After all the revelations about the DNA and the discovery that Joseph and Elizabeth were Claire's biological grandparents, a new question arose. Where was her father, Nathan, the man who had left her on his parents' doorstep so many years ago, disappearing without a trace? And who had donated the kidney? Determined to find answers, Joseph and Elizabeth began searching for him. It was a long process, full of uncertainty and emotions. Meanwhile, Claire tried to process all the new information about her origins. She had so many questions for her biological father, so many things she needed to understand about why he had left her behind. Finally, after some time searching, they found a lead about Nathan's whereabouts. He had been the one to donate the kidney, and he was living in another town, in a simple, isolated house. When they arrived, they didn't know what to expect. Claire was nervous, her heart racing, as Elizabeth and Joseph accompanied her. When they knocked on the door, a tired-looking man opened it. It was Nathan, but he was different from what Claire had imagined. He was in a wheelchair, his eyes marked by time and pain. He looked at Claire and her parents with a surprised expression, but soon recognition filled his face. "Claire," he asked, his voice weak but full of emotion. "Is that you, my daughter?" Claire stood still for a moment, not knowing how to react. Was this real? The person she had imagined and wondered about for so long was right there in front of her, and he seemed so different from what she had expected. "It's me," Claire replied, her voice trembling. "I came because I needed to find you. I needed to understand why you left me and why you ended up donating the kidney." Nathan lowered his head, visibly emotional, and then in a soft voice began to tell his story. "I never wanted to leave you, Claire. It was the hardest thing I ever did. But I had no choice." Elizabeth and Joseph, who had been silent until now, watched, feeling the tension of the moment. "When you were a baby," Nathan continued, "your mother and I were in a car accident. It was terrible. Your mother, she didn't survive. And I ended up like this, in this wheelchair, unable to move properly without the strength to take care of you." Claire felt a tightness in her chest, hearing about her biological mother. She had never known much about her, and now she was finding out that her death had been the turning point for everything. "I was lost, Claire. Without your mother, unable to take care of myself, let alone a baby," Nathan said, tears filling his eyes. "I took you to my parents' house because I knew you'd be safe with them. I knew you'd have the love and care I couldn't give you at that moment." Claire, who had been listening silently until then, began to cry. "So, you left me there because you loved me? Because you didn't have the strength?" Nathan nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, love. It was never because I didn't want you. It was because I knew in that state I couldn't be the father you deserved. I thought about you every day. I always wanted to come back, but I felt so guilty. I thought you were better off without me. Forgive me, Dad. Forgive me, Mum. I never should have done what I did. I was so ashamed. After everything that happened, I couldn't just come back with nothing but problems. You're the best people I've ever known. I didn't think of anyone else to care for Claire," Nathan continued, his voice breaking. Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, moved closer to Nathan and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We took care of her, Nathan, with all the love we could give, and now she's here, and so are you. It's time for us to let go of this guilt." Claire slowly approached, kneeling beside Nathan's wheelchair. She looked at him, not with anger, but with understanding. "I just wanted to know you, to understand why everything happened, and now that I do, I think I can forgive you." Nathan looked at her with tears and emotion in his eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Claire, but I thank you with all my heart. You're everything I ever wanted you to be, strong, loving, and surrounded by people who love you." Claire hugged Nathan, finally feeling some peace in her heart. The story of her life, filled with gaps and secrets, was now starting to make sense. She hadn't been abandoned out of lack of love, but because of circumstances beyond Nathan's control. In time, Claire, Nathan, Elizabeth, and Joseph began to meet more often. Claire, who once carried so many doubts and resentments, now began to see her biological father not as someone who abandoned her, but as someone who did what he thought was best in the face of a tragedy. And so the family, despite all the pain and challenges, began to heal. Over time, Claire's life completely changed. After finding Nathan and hearing his story, something inside her transformed. The resentment and pain she had carried began to fade, replaced by a new sense of understanding and acceptance. Claire, who had once been rebellious and distant, now became a completely different person. Elizabeth and Joseph's house, once filled with tension, was now a place of peace. The family, which had been divided for so long by secrets and distance, was finally truly united. Claire, now more mature, had come to understand how loved she was and how much her family, despite their mistakes in the past, had always wanted the best for her. Nathan began visiting more often, and Claire spent hours by his side, listening to his stories, caring for him, and helping with whatever he needed. She found new joy in being there for him after so much time apart. It was her way of giving back for the decision he made to leave her with Elizabeth and Joseph, even though it had been a painful choice. On a quiet morning, Claire was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for everyone. Joseph walked in, still a bit sleepy, and smiled as he saw the table being set with such care. "You've become quite the cook, Claire," he commented, his eyes shining. "I don't even know how we managed before, without you taking such good care of us." Claire laughed softly, placing more bread on the table. "I think I learned from the best," she said, glancing at Elizabeth, who was helping Nathan sit at the table. Elizabeth, who had once been so worried about Claire, now looked at her granddaughter with pride. "You've always had it in you, my dear. It was just waiting for the right moment to bloom." Nathan, already seated in his chair, looked at Claire with gratitude. "I never imagined we'd have the chance to live this together. After so many years seeing you like this, so caring and loving, it's a gift I never thought I deserved." Claire placed a cup of coffee in front of her father and knelt beside him, holding his hand. "We've all made mistakes, Dad. What matters is that we're together now, and I just want to take care of you the way you all have always taken care of me." From that moment, the family dynamic changed for the better. Claire devoted herself wholeheartedly to the well-being of her grandparents and Nathan. When she wasn't looking after the house or preparing something special for everyone, she took Nathan on outdoor walks, talking about everything they had missed during their years apart. Slowly, the bond between them grew stronger, and the wounds of the past began to heal. Elizabeth and Joseph, in turn, felt lighter, seeing their granddaughter become a strong, kind, and compassionate woman. The house, once filled with arguments and silence, was now full of laughter and heartfelt conversations. One day, as they all sat together in the living room, Joseph looked at Claire and said, "I knew from the day we found you on our doorstep that you were destined to be someone special. You brought light into our lives, Claire." Claire moved, smiled, and replied, "I'm only like this because of you. Everything I am today is a reflection of the love you gave me." This story teaches us that true love doesn't only come from blood ties, but from the choices we make, the sacrifices, and the care we offer to others. Claire, Elizabeth, Joseph, and Nathan showed us that even in the face of great challenges, it's possible to find forgiveness, heal past wounds, and build a family based on love and understanding. If this journey touched your heart, share in the comments what moved you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this one, reminding us of the power of family and true love. Now, click on the video that will appear on your screen, or check out the special playlist we've prepared for you. Don't miss the next stories that will also move and inspire you.